Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here in just a couple minutes. Thanks for showing up. You are in the right place if you're here for the Amcas walkthrough workshop for the 2022 cycle. There is this link that is on this link that's on the first slide is a link that will get you the presentation slides themselves and a handout from the registrar about how to order your transcript. Great. So go ahead and get started. And it'll, at the beginning here, it's going to be a lot of me talking and kind of explaining a bunch of stuff. Please, generally going to hold questions at the end, just because there's quite a bit of material. I want to make sure to get through it all, but we'll definitely have time for Q&A at the end, and I'll definitely stick around if you've got questions after the presentation. Okay. So just a quick introduction to our office. I'm the person in blue. I'm Ethan Bull. I'm a pre-health advisor in the A Center. And so we work with students from any major, and we support them in applying or preparing to apply for graduate health professions programs. And Josie is our director. She's here today. And we have two other amazing advisors. Renee Lozano is a pre-health advisor in our office, and Lauren Mosley is relatively new, just getting geared up. She just gave me a thumbs up, which is great. Okay, just so we get a little bit of a sense of who's here with us today, do you mind just putting in the chat, what year are you? Like, are you first year student, sophomore, junior, senior? Sophomore, junior, senior. Okay, so a nice range of folks. So people that are probably applying soon, or to people that aren't going to be applying till next year. Great, awesome, thanks so much. And yeah, as I said, please try to hold your questions till the end. Because there's a lot of detail. This is the Amcas, and it's a very detail-oriented thing. And so I do want to try to get through the presentation and make sure I cover kind of the whole application. But then please jot down notes of any questions that you have, so that we can ask. You can ask at the end, so you don't forget. Kind of as we go section by section. We are going to be recording this. Currently recording, and we're going to be posting it on our website. In the signature events section of the A Center website. So the same place that you RSVP'd for this session is going to be where the recording is housed. And you can definitely share it with others and share the link and watch it again for sure. I don't know, you might not want to watch it again, but we'll see. So the basics of Amcas. So the Amcas is the American Medical College Application Service, for short, the Amcas. It is the primary application for MD schools in the United States. It's used for a total of 152 schools, which includes all of the MD schools except for those in Texas. Texas has its own medical school application service called the TMD SAS that Baylor also uses. So the Texas public schools plus the private Baylor school, which is in Texas. So if you're applying to Texas schools, you're going to get that one, but for every other MD school, you would use the Amcas. And then this is not the application that you would use to apply to DO schools. Osteopathic medicine has its own common application called the ACOMAS. And so you'd use that one. Basic costs. So it's $170 to apply to one school through the Mcas. And then this year it's $42 for each additional school. We know that adds up to a lot. And so if you are eligible for the fee assistance program, we definitely recommend that you apply. And there'll be a few slides with more details about that later on. The application this year opens on May 3rd. So that's when the Amcas opens and you can start filling things in. You can put in your personal details. You can start adding in your classes and your activities and all that kind of stuff. And then on May 27th is when you can start submitting it. So between May 3rd and May 27th, you can't submit. On the 27th, you can finally click the submit button. And then it moves into the verification process with the AAMC and through the Amcas. It can take up to 6 to 8 weeks for your application to be verified, and we'll talk in a future slide a little bit more about that verification process. And then, right, so there's this period of time where the Mcas is working on verifying applications. And then finally on June 25th this year is when they're finally going to make those applications available to medical schools, who will then start looking at who applied to their schools and making decisions about who they want to invite for interviews and that kind of stuff. So starting on June 25th, they'll start getting that information. And then in terms of costs, an additional cost you want to think about for sure are secondary application costs. So this is the primary application. That's $170 for one school and $42 for each additional school. But every school you apply to pretty much is going to have a secondary application, and most of those have extra application fees that can range between $25 and $100. So those are extra costs. If you are accepted for the fee assistance program, many schools waive or reduce the cost of those secondary application fees. So more about the verification process. Basically, once you click submit on May 27th, the Amcas is waiting for your official transcripts to arrive. So as soon as your official transcripts arrive and you've clicked submit, and then in your Amcas application, you'll see once those things happen, you'll be in the ready for review status. You'll go into the verification queue, and basically they start verifying applications in the order that they're received. Verification from the Amcas is literally they're looking at your transcripts, and then they're looking at the catalog of the school that you attended, and they're making sure that the courses that you put in and the ways that you've classified those courses as biology or physics or that kind of thing, just making sure that those things match up. Once they've made sure that those things match up, your application has been verified, and that means that schools can start working through their process with it. If you submit your application after May 27th, right, it goes into that verification queue, and they just do it in order and send them along to schools starting on June 25th, but then on a rolling basis after that. And so just another visual kind of for how this works, right? So starting on May 27th, you can submit your application. Applications get processed by the Mcas folks, the AAMC folks, and then on June 25th, they start delivering your applications to schools. More general timeline. Right, I mean, this is very general, include everything on here, but there's tons of stuff on here. So January to May, and right here in April, so we're, a portion of this has already gone by. We recommend contacting letter writers, taking the MCAT, starting your personal statement, starting on your work and activities section, starting on your most meaningful experiences section, and certainly ordering your transcripts to use to enter your courses into the Amcas application. Then on May 3rd, the application opens. And as soon as that application opens, you can recontact your letter writers when the application opens, and we'll go over this in a bit more detail and give you some visuals, but you'll be able to create a recommendation letter entry, and then that allows you to generate a PDF document that you need to send to your letter writers so that they can submit your letter through the Amcas system. It be attached to your application. The identification numbers that are included in there are essential so that the Amcas can connect the application letter with your actual app. You obviously work on the application between May 23rd and May 27th, or around as close to then as possible. Around May 27th, you can start dating, and usually you want to as close to that date as possible by mid-June if you can, just so that your application is in as soon as possible, so that with rolling admission, you have the chance of being considered before they've started up their medical school classes. After that initial submission, you might do a little bit more. So in June, you might start preparing your secondary applications, start starting July and going through the rest of the fall, sometimes beyond that. So you might look up common questions, drafting answers, to those kind of common questions so that you're prepared when secondary start to come in. You might continue or start practice interviews, plan close. Travel's a question, right? Is this year be all virtual? And maybe, hard to tell. It's going to depend on the schools. And then we also recommend start continuing to build knowledge of current healthcare issues. So, I particularly like the AMA has some good things that you can subscribe to, including the AMA Morning Rounds, which is newsletter that tells you from the American Medical Association what kinds their members are thinking about. So it's a great way of staying up to date. There's also some podcasts and a variety of other ways of staying up to date. But it's very common for an interview to be out, kind of common topics that are healthcare issues that are pretty recent. So that's why you'd want to do that. July 1st, secondary applicant coming in. You usually want to turn those within 2 weeks if you can. They check school deadlines because those things can vary. And then August, all the way through to the following year, more secondary applications come in. Interviews start as early as in the school, but then certainly continue in the spring of the following year. And then, as soon as you get an interview, acceptances can start. So acceptances can come in as early as September after an interview has occurred. And then, in the end, that following spring, so about a year from now, students need to finalize their decisions on schools, right? So if you have multiple acceptances, you'll need to finalize those decisions. And then, April 30th is a really important date for choosing your medical school tool. And so sometimes there's a lot of movement after that. So people are students may be on wait lists. And so right around there, students make decisions about where they want to go, which may free up spaces in schools. And so there's quite a bit of movement in that area as well. We do like this reminder, don't stop with your clinical and other experiences just in case. So definitely you're going to get into medical school this time when you apply, but just in case, it's a great idea for you to act like maybe you needed to apply again. And so making sure you're continuing to build your resume, continuing to build your application is a great idea. So accessing the application itself. So you probably have a AAMC account if you signed up for the MCAT already. And so if you do, you're going to use that same sign-in information to sign into the Amcas on May 3rd when it's open and available. If you don't have a AAMC account, you'll want to do that first and then start with the application. These are the different sections. So there's identifying information, schools attended, biographical information, coursework, work and activities, letters of evaluation, medical schools that you're going to apply to, essays, and then standardized tests. So we're going to go through each of those sections and talk about different things you may want to remember. And so when you actually log in, this is what it looks like, and you can kind of see there on the right those different sections that I just listed. And as you complete the application, there'll be letter requests that you can print. There'll be application status information that's available and other details there as well. So starting at the very beginning, identifying information tips. So you definitely want to use your student ID numbers for the U of A or any other institution that you've attended. Having those ID numbers in the system helps them make sure to match your documents up with your application just in case. And then in the identifying information section, typically it's populated from your AAMC profile. And so much of it is auto-filled from that. And so sometimes if you want to change things in this section, you need to actually change things in your AAMC profile. Then comes schools that you have attended. So you want to include every university, that includes every session that you've attended. So that means a community college you've attended. Even if you never went to a community college, but you took a dual enrollment class in high school, you're going to include that institution in the schools attended. Any study abroad coursework, if it was at an institution that wasn't your home institution, you'll need to include that. Summer sessions, winter sessions, just any post-secondary, post-high school college or university that you attended, you need to include for sure. And as soon as you enter a school, you can create a transcript request form. And so once you've entered a school, and you can kind of see the example on the screen, in the screenshot here, you have that create transcript request form. This generates a PDF document that has identification numbers on it that are essential for matching your transcript that you order from your university or your community college with your actual application itself, your Amcas ID numbers. And so you'll want to generate one of those for each of the schools that you that you've entered, that you've attended, that you're going to be providing transcripts for, official transcripts for. Many schools like the U of A have an electronic process. And so you may generate this document, but you're not actually sending this document to the U of A registrar. You might send it to a different university that you've attended, but you're not actually sending it here to the U of A, but you are using the identification numbers that you've generated on this when you're requesting that transcript. And I know this is a very text-heavy slide, but you have access to the slides. And that's why I wanted to provide as much detail here. I reached out to the registrar and wanted to get an update from them for how this process works. Sure that you are accessing the slides for details on this. And there's also a slide. There's a handout in that link that's from the registrar that shows you how to order a transcript. But basically, you're going to follow the process at each of your institutions. I'm going to tell you about U of A. You'll need to learn about the processes at different institutions you've attended. These are reminders from the U of A registrar. They cannot process your transcript requests if you have a hold on your account, so you need to make sure to get those resolved. You have to place the order yourself, and you must do it online through UAccess. When you make your transcript order on UAccess, it's going to direct you to the company that U of A contracts with to these electronic transcripts, and that's Credential Solutions, which has just been bought by Parchment. So they're kind of one and the same. You're likely to see Credential Solutions for now in this cycle, as far as I understand. You're not going to send that PDF document that you created in the Amcas, but you're going to use those Amcas ID numbers and AAMC ID numbers as part of the request. When you generate your request, you're going to include your AAMC ID that's on that generated PDF document in your Amcas. And you're going to indicate you have an attachment and indicate to include the ID number in the attachment drop-down section. So you're going to do that. And so when you're ordering your transcript, they're able to electronically send your AAMC ID so that transcript can easily get matched up with your Amcas application. And if you need support from Credential Solutions, so that portal that you access, but it goes to an outside company that we contract with, their contact details are on here. And then there's plenty of different ways of getting in touch with the registrar who can help. They've got phone numbers. You can email them, and then they have this new live chat, which can be super useful. And just a quick reminder, you got to wait for your final grades to come out, your final grades to be posted before you order your official transcript and have it sent to the Amcas. You likely want to make sure that that's in there those grades are finally posted in May before you have it sent in, so that medical schools can consider those grades as part of your application as well. Also in this section, in the schools attendance section, they ask you if there was ever an institutional action that happened at your school. And so, it can be a conduct violation or something like that. You can read more about it in the link in the application itself, but you do need to report anything. It's supposed to be anything, even if it was expunged from your record, you're supposed to report it. And you can read more in the Mcas guide about it, and we'll have links to that a little bit later. But if you do, you're supposed to report everything. You're supposed to explain what happened, take responsibility. Usually it's not a big deal, but that's their expectation. And then also in this section is the advisor release. Please release this to us. If you click the box that says advisor release, it just means when we pull data from the system, we get data about your application. And so we can learn about how our students are doing. We can learn about what processes are working well for our students. And so please check that box in there. In the biographical information section, you do want to make sure, depending on your status, that all the schools you're applying to do accept people that have your status. And so that's going to mean if you're an international student, you'll want to make sure you're only applying to schools that accept international students. If you're a DACA student, you want to make sure you're applying to DACA-friendly schools as well. And you can find that information out in the MSAR. Also in this section is the disadvantaged status portion. I recommend reading the definition. It's kind of a personal decision about whether you want to click yes for this one or not. I encourage you to click yes if you fit into the definition. Some students don't feel like they're disadvantaged and so don't feel comfortable checking this box, and that's certainly a personal decision. But I do encourage you to check the box if you do fit into these categories, and include the description. Coursework. This is one of the longer and more complicated sections of the application. Couple tips. So anyone who has dual enrollment or AP credit, you're going to report that credit in your freshman year, because that's where it's listed on your transcript. You're going to have to classify you're going to need to classify each course that you've taken. And so you'll need to use the course classification guide, which will tell you, this nutrition class, does it count as a biology, right? Or where does it fit? And so they have a detailed guide for how to classify those. And so you'll want to use that. And then at the bottom, if you do have a course that you GRO'd, that you did a grade replacement opportunity for, that's going to be, you're going to list that as repeat. And you do have to make sure if you GRO'd a course, you're going to list the grade both times you took it. And the Amcas is going to factor both of those into your GPA, unlike U of A. I encourage you to watch all the video tutorials within the application. It takes extra time. It can kind of be tedious, but there's lots of great details in there. So I really recommend that. And you can kind of see at the bottom of the screen, there's a bunch of different tutorials that you can watch. And so I really recommend those, particularly the study abroad section. It can be really tricky to enter that correctly. And so that video, if you have study abroad coursework, is particularly important. And there's going to be maybe 10 links to the 2022 Amcas applicant guide. It's like an 85-page guide that kind of gives you line by line what you should be doing. And so this is going to be a really important link for you, a really important guide. As you do the application, you want to make sure you're carefully following those tips. Last year, the average student had to create 52 entries in the coursework section. So you're doing it individually for each course that you've taken. And so I thought that was an interesting tidbit. Grade forgiveness, like I said, the Mcas does not recognize grade forgiveness like GRO. So when you are entering GRO, the second time you took it, that GRO grade, you're going to say it's repeat, and then you're going to enter both grades that are received, and both of those are going to be factored into your Amcas GPA. You can include future coursework. So you should include future coursework that you've planned, especially if you haven't finished all the prerequisites. But even if you have, you can indicate classes you're planning to take the following year. And you can indicate coursework that's in progress, like if you're taking the summer course and while you're filling out the application, you're in a class. Verification process. So once your application has been verified, in that once you have entered all your grades and submitted going to verify it. Mcas goes through and they might reclassify some of your classes. So if you said a class was biology and they don't think it was, they might switch to other science or other, right? They might put it in a category. So you can go and check after verification just what happened and if they made any switches. And then if you disagree and do an academic change request, it's pretty unlikely or uncommon, but it's definitely something worth checking into. You often have to provide proof with a syllabus to say, look, this was a biology course, the coursework was more than 50 science, it should be included in this category. They do sometimes make mistakes, but you know that that is available. It's always a good idea to know what your GPA is and know what the Amcas is going to be reporting to medicals when they get your application. And so there's right links on this page for calculating your Amcas GPA, including an Excel sheet where you can enter things that course classification, you're categorizing them in the biology, chemistry, physics, and math categories that go into the science GPA for the Amcas, so that you have a really good sense of how that works. In terms of qualification, we usually have like the 50% rule. So if 50% or more of the class was science or science heavy, then it's probably a science. And if it fits into one of those categories, you know, it would biology, chemistry, physics, or math, it would work and it would be in that category. If it was less than, probably you're not going to consider it in that category. And right, you're doing the same thing, right? You've got to classify your classes when you're calculating your GPA in the same way you would when you're entering your coursework into the Amcas to calculate your science GPA, of GPA. Next section is the work activity section. You will have 15 spaces for entries. You do not have to fill them all, but you can, and people do. In addition to those 15 entries, you will have 3 of those 15 that you can categorize as your most meaningful. So regular entries and 3 most meaningful entries. Meaningful ones, you'll have extra space, 25 extra characters to talk about what was really meaningful about that experience. For the other 12, you'll have 700 characters to describe them. You can use 3 additional date ranges. So let's imagine you did not and you did it, you know, for a month here and then 4 months here and then again for another 6 months. You use those different date range and you include hours, you know, an estimate of hours per week, but it's also pretty common to list the total hours if you can. Different types of activities, you are going to classify your work activities as well. Just like your courses, you're going to give a good faith effort as long as you're not trying to misrepresent them and you're doing the best you can to put them in the correct category. You're not going to be penalized for it. So you're just going to make a good faith effort to put them in the right category. Particularly where this occurs is lots of students debate community service volunteering medical / clinical or community service volunteering not medical / clinical. So I was working at a hospital, but I was at the front desk. And so is that clinical? Is it not clinical? You know, make a good faith effort. You know, I tend to lean towards, you know, if you're in a hospital setting or a healthcare setting, I would classify it as clinical, but in your description, be honest about what you were doing. And medical schools will be able to judge that themselves based on their own perspectives. So yeah, tons of different categories. Do the best you can to fit them into those different categories. And yeah, 700 characters for each of the 12. And then for those most meaningful, you've got the 700 plus 1325 for a total of 2025. Take advantage of the space. So if you're labeling something as most meaningful, use the 700 characters and use the 1325. Don't skip the 700 and do the 1325. This is a great opportunity for you to show them who you are, show them what your values are, show them something that you weren't able to include in your personal statement, but that you want them to know. And remember, everything counts. Everything helps paint a picture of who you are, what you spent your time doing, and what you value. So the other thing students really debate seems to be, well, I was a DJ. And I spent 15 hours a week doing that. It was really important to me. I really find it valuable. Do I include that? You can, right? You can include it in hobby or paid work. And schools want to get to know you. So as long as you're talking about it in a meaningful way and talking about the ways that you grew and you did from those experiences, it can be appropriate, but that's a personal decision. So some students decide not to include certain things. Some students decide to include certain things. That is a personal decision, but remember, they want to know who you are, as well as, all the different things that you've done. You can also report future activities. So let's imagine you're in an activity on May 27th, and it's going to continue until August. You can report that it's continuing until August. So it's got a future end date, or that it's continuing beyond that, all the way up through August 2022. If you have an activity that hasn't started yet, you can report future activities. Remember that if you don't have very much experience, and the only experience you have is stuff that you've planned for the future, while they love seeing the stuff that you're planning to do in the future, and that's really valuable for them to see, they're often not going to make decisions about whether to invite you for an interview or not, if the rest of your experiences that you've done up to that point aren't very robust, and it's just mostly stuff in the future. In terms of shadowing, this one is kind of complicated, and so I just wanted to share a few different tips. There's a bunch of different ways of including your shadowing experience. This is in particular if you've shadowed 4 or 5 different folks, right? And maybe you want to use 4 or 5 different entries out of your 15. Many people don't. So some put them all into one entry. Some people divide them into 2, one being really meaningful for them and one being, a list of the other 3 or 4 that they've done that aren't quite as meaningful. One will put all of them into one entry and select it as one of the most meaningful, using those extra characters to talk about one of those multiple experiences that was particularly useful. Or another way, there's no one right way to do it. As long as you're being clear and communicating what you've done and how you've grown and what you value, it's perfectly reasonable. So there's a few examples on here. I won't go through them in much detail, but they're there on the slides. So those two of the examples that I talked about for how to put it into the application, if you have multiple shadowing experiences, there's some examples there that may be useful. And I pulled this from the University of Utah, did a session about how to do the Amcas application in April 2020. And I thought it was particularly useful, so I pulled it from there. Letters of evaluation. So this is recommendation letters. You are, when you start the application on May 3rd, you can generate a PDF document that you're going to send to your recommenders, your evaluators, and they will. That's what they're going to use to be able to attach their rec letter to your particular application. You can submit your application before you send these PDF documents, or even assign recommendation letters, but as close to May 3rd as possible, generating that PDF and getting it off to your recommenders. It's great, right? They give them more time rather than less. So the earlier they have that document, if they want to get the letter done early, they can get it done early and just squared away. So the earlier you get that, the better. Most schools don't actually start looking at rec letters until July 15th to the August 1st range. And so when you are setting timelines for your evaluators or your recommenders, just keep that in mind. Remember, you can't see your letter, so or see it or read it. So don't let your evaluator send it to you or show it to you. You're not allowed to see those. We do have some recommendations for what to send to your evaluators. So between January and April, which is now, depending on what your evaluators want, what kind of relationships, these are just general recommendations, maybe a letter explaining your experience with them, a timeline for when you want them to have the letter in, right? So the PDF is going to be generated. I'm going to do it on May 5th, and I'm going to send it to you. And so then please have it in by this date. Your resume, a draft of statement, anything else they want. So, your evaluators might ask for something else. And then there's also this Amcas letter writer's guide. So there's a guide that shows letter writers how to write a recommendation letter, the core competencies, so that they can attest to those competencies that medical schools are looking for, and focus on those. So you want to write, definitely send that letter writer's guide and a variety of those other things. And then in May, right, as soon as the Mcas opens, you want to generate those PDFs, create those those recommendation letter entries, generate those PDFs and send them off to your evaluators. And then they'll use the details on there to be able to access the Amcas system and upload your letter without you having to being able to view it. Maximum number of letters you can have is 10, but that's too many. Last year, the average per student was 2 to 3 letters. We think right around 5 is the sweet spot. You can choose where your letters are sent. So which letters go to which schools. So let's imagine you had 8 letters uploaded into the Amcas system. You might choose these 5 to go to this place and these other 3 plus these other 2 to go to this other place. So you get to choose which letters go where, particularly if you have a letter that, you have a school that's focused, really on underserved populations, and you have one letter from an experience you have that relates to that seems particularly appropriate for them, or for a different school they really focus on research, and so you've got your PI letter and you definitely want to make sure that goes there. So you get to pick and choose the letters we recommend, and there's no formula for this. There's no one right answer, but we recommend these 5 letters. 2 science professors who have taught you in a class and given you a grade, 1 non-science professor who's taught you in a class and given you a grade, 1 clinician, so that might be a physician that you've shadowed, a nurse practitioner you've worked alongside, a physical therapist, and then 1 other, right? So it kind of depends on what you've done. If you were in a research lab for a while, probably the PI in your research lab. If you worked somewhere for a really long time, maybe your employment supervisor. If you volunteered somewhere for a long time, maybe your volunteer supervisor knows you really well. So those are the 5 letters we recommend. But again, there's no one right formula. It's going to depend on your situation. The U of A does not do committee letters or packet letters. So when you're doing the Amcas, you're going to use the individual, you're going to check that box that says individual letter. When you put in your letter of evaluation entries, they'll look like this: Dean Bob Ross, Dr. Letter, right? And there's this little button that says letter request form, and that's the PDF document I'm talking about. You click that button, it generates a PDF document. You can save that. You can send it as an email attachment to your evaluators. And then you can track progress in your Amcas account. You can see if the person submitted the letter, if it's been received, that kind of stuff. If you are a reapplicant this year, we do recommend getting updated letters with updated information and certainly an updated date. If you're thinking about taking gap years or a gap year, you do want an updated letter, right? And you want it to reflect what you've done as recently as possible as well. So, let's imagine you took 2 gap years, and so you're using a recommender from your undergraduate experience. You want that to recommend what you've done in your undergraduate experience, but also it might reflect some of the stuff you've done since then. You can use Interfolio for recommendation letters. It's not super necessary for most students, but for some it's a good fit. Because you want updated letters, Interfolio, you can kind of store them in there and use future years and that kind of thing, but you want updated letters. So it doesn't always work for most people, but sometimes if you're applying to, the WC and the ACOMAS, like you're applying to DO schools, or you're applying to PT and another place, or you're applying to Texas schools, Interfolio can be a way of having your letters to multiple places and stored. So it's something to look into. And again, I recommend all the tutorials in the Amcas in as well are super useful. So I definitely recommend watching this. They can really ease trying to figure out what they're asking for. And so overview of the process, right? The applicant creates an entry, generates a letter request form. It goes to the letter authors, so your writers. They upload it into the Amcas, and then on June 25th, when those are finally sent along to schools, it gets sent along to the schools, and then on a rolling basis, right? So on June 25th, your application gets sent along to schools, but then whenever your letter comes in, it just on a rolling basis gets sent along and added to your file that those medical schools see. And the reason why medical schools aren't really looking at your letters until July 15th, August 1st, or sometimes even later than that, is because they're getting your initial application, they're looking at it, they're sending you a secondary application. Maybe you're taking 2 weeks to get it, then you're sending it back, and they're starting only when they get that secondary application back will they really start looking at your recommendation letters. And so that's why we recommend July 15th at the very earliest, but August 1st is usually a reasonable date, as long as they have your recommenders have it in by then. Usually fine. This is a chart that shows you when letters of evaluation were received, just so you have some data around that. So the vast majority last year in 2021 were received in June, in July as well, about the same level. And so fewer in May, fewer in August, and then fewer going on beyond that, right? So that June, July, August is just fine. The next section, Amcas, is the medical school section. This is where you choose which medical school to apply to. This is where, if you're choosing MD, PhD, this is where you would select that you're applying to a joint degree program. In terms of applying, you have to choose at least one school in order to submit the application and go into the verification queue. The average is 15 to 20 that students apply to. You can add schools after you submit your application, and it won't delay, right? So it's kind of as soon as you add a new school, if your file's all up, your application's all very ready, it goes right along to that school. And then if you're trying to figure out where to apply, and I want to use the MSAR, and then often also need to go to school websites, I usually recommend making a spreadsheet. The more carefully you think about schools, the better chance you have of getting in, right? If you're choosing schools that are a good match for you, that match with your values, that your metrics are a good match for them, all those kinds of things. So, look at their missions, look at where they are, look at what tracks they have, right? Do they have a rural medicine track? And are you really interested in rural medicine? Look at the programs that they offer, student clubs, and the research they have on campus. Often, right? Mission statements are all pretty vague and they all sound the same. But sometimes when you drill to these other areas, you can really start to get a sense of those values and how well they match with you. Curriculum structure matters, right? Some schools have flipped curriculum where you do lectures online and then come to class to do didactic, or to do group work and that kind of stuff. So make sure that's going to fit for you. Certainly look at the metrics and the averages in MSAR to see if your GPA MCAT is within their range, right? If you're not right at that average, that doesn't, you're not competitive, but make sure you're in that range. State residency matters too. So, look at a school and make sure they're accepting 15% or more of students from out of state. Otherwise, right, they're just so laser focused on serving students in their state that it can be really hard for you to get in, and sometimes it may not be worth applying there. So take a look at that. Make sure you're also taking a look at all the requirements. So do they require a doctor letter? Make sure you have a doctor letter, right? Do they require 2 science professors? Make sure you have 2 science professors. So depending on the school, those things can differ. Make sure you're hitting the prereqs. Just double check those things to make sure that you're applying to places that you have a chance of getting into. The next section is the personal comments essay, also known as the personal statement. The basic prompt is use the space provided to explain why you want to go to medical school. If you click on the link, there's a little bit more detail. So I do recommend reading over that as well. We also have a personal statement workshop that we did recently. The video is posted on our website, so I encourage you to go there for further support. A couple tips in that box that you saw, right? So this box, you want to retype it in there. If you copy and paste from Microsoft Word, sometimes there's embedded formatting you don't realize is there. And so when they download that essay, there's weird characters in there, stars and exclamation points and dollar signs and percentages. So you do want to retype it into there, even though that's really tedious. They do say sometimes if you have a program like Notepad that is like in a rich text format, or like in no format, has no formatting whatsoever, you can copy and paste and it's fine. But it's hard to check on it, so we usually just recommend retyping it. Personal comments essay can be up to 5,300 characters, and that does include spaces. And there's a link in here to that personal statement workshop I just mentioned. If you are applying to MD, PhD, there are 2 additional essays, right? One that talks about why you're pursuing MD, PhD. which is 3,000 characters, and your total hours of prior research experience. The next section is the standardized tests section. So these are automatically pushed into your Amcas application. The AAMC runs the MCAT, the AAMC runs the Amcas, right? So these systems are all joined together. And so when you take the test, your score is automatically loaded into your application. That's not something you need to do. But you can, right, when it gets loaded in there, you can view it, right? You can view the score breakdowns and percentile ranks in the same ways that medical schools will be able to. So it's a good idea to take a look at those. One thing you do need to be careful of, if you have a future MCAT date, make sure you report it here. So if you haven't taken the MCAT yet, when you submit, report that future date. If you're retaking the MCAT, most importantly, if you're retaking the MCAT, make sure you put that future date in here. Otherwise, they're going to think that initial score is the score that you want to apply with, and that may lead to like an immediate rejection if that score wasn't up to their minimum requirements. And so if you're retaking the MCAT after submission, make sure you put that future date in there. Things you can do after you apply. After you click the submit button. So there's a link here. I would recommend reading it, but you can add medical schools, right? And so again, there's no delay in schools getting your application. So once it's verified and all ready to go, if you add a medical school, it kind of on a rolling basis just gets sent along to them. You can go back in and be like, oh, I forgot to release my information to my pre-health advisor. You can go ahead and do that. You can add recommendation letters up to that maximum of 10, but you can't delete entries. You can change ID numbers, name, contact details, that kind of stuff, and you can change reported future MCAT testing dates. Every time you do make a change though, and so in red at the bottom, you must recertify and officially update your application to make that change, or that information doesn't go along to medical school. So make sure that you're doing that. And it shouldn't cause any delays. COVID. In the primary application, there's no section for you to talk about COVID explicitly, but many secondary applications will include a question that says, hey, how did COVID affect you? Or something to that effect. We recommend talking about your experience in general, maybe academics, personal, family, health, finances, any way that it affected you. All those things are relevant. We recommend being clear and to the point. Be willing to share while not appearing to be making excuses. So take responsibility while sharing that there were challenges. And as we said before, secondaries come in mid-July through November, December, sometimes even later than that. And you do want to try to get them in within 2 weeks, but look at schools' deadlines because those may be a little bit different. Fee assistance is amazing. If you are eligible, this is a great resource. It can save you up to $2,000. So definitely double check. My understanding is that if you make up to 400% of the poverty guidelines moved up from 300%, you'd be eligible for the fee assistance program. So they made it easier to get last year and this year. And so definitely look into it. You get a bunch of stuff. But benefits aren't retroactive. So if you signed up for the MCAT, you got to pay that full amount. You don't get a reduced price. If you've already clicked submit and paid, you don't get a reduced price. So you are eligible for up to 2 years when you apply, and you can apply multiple times. And so basically it's designed so you can use the MCAT prep materials. You can use the MSAR to do research into schools. You can apply to up to 20 schools, right? So you can use all of those benefits, and that's often like this 2-year stretch of time. And so they are, you can use them up to that period. You can reapply for them. DACA students are eligible for fee assistance. The application is complicated, even a little bit more complicated maybe than FAFSA, so definitely start early. And there's tons of benefits. So MCAT prep materials, MSAR subscription, reduced cost to take the MCAT, up to 20 primary application fees are waived, and then many schools, depending on the school, waive the cost of secondary applications or reduce the cost. Tons of tools on the Amcas website, so definitely take a look at their tutorials, definitely follow Amcas info on Twitter, and definitely download that linked guide. other awesome resources are here. So it's the applicant guide. This is maybe the third time I've linked it, but it's really, really important. It's 85 pages long. It's amazingly detailed. Pre-Health Information Central is a website we have in D2L. You can self-register for it. The Amcas website's great. You can look at the participating schools and deadlines page for criminal background check information if you get accepted. Two really great resources. The Anatomy of an Applicant Self-Assessment Guide is like this PDF document that helps you self-assess yourself about the core competencies to see where you're weaker and where you're stronger. It's a really good place to help you kind of honestly assess where you are. And it may help you think about what you want to emphasize in your application. And then they've got these great applicant profiles that they added, where, a student that got in explains, here's, how I applied, here's what I wrote in my personal statement. And then medical school folks are talking about, why they accepted this person and what was good about their application. It can really give you some great insight into what makes a great application, so you can make sure to do your Amcas in the best possible way to represent all the amazing stuff that you've done and the amazing person that you are. The Amcas does have an official webinar for students. It is full, but if you follow this link, you can sign up to get the video once they publish that. And then there are some other great webinar videos on the AAMC website for pre-med students. Again, you can access this presentation with all the great links in here, as well as that handout from the registrar about how to order a transcript here at U of A. At that bit.ly/Ethan Amcas link.